Hi, my name is Raymond Sun. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at Washington State University. I'm directing the Washington State Community Service Project centered around the 190 Washington State College servicemen who fought and died in World War II. This is tied to the Friends of the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. that asked teachers around the country to create community service projects to enhance public knowledge and awareness of the contributions of these veterans. Here at Washington State, what we're doing is we're working with records of these students which are kept in the manuscripts, archives, and special collections. And over the past year, I've asked students to go through these records and create life stories for about 24 servicemen who fought and died in the war. What you're going to be seeing in this video are the impressions of the archivists and some of the student volunteers who worked in this project who will tell you about their projects and what it means to them.
My name is Marco English. I'm the University Archivist here at Washington State University, Manuscripts, Archives, Special Collections, or the MASC, M-A-S-C.
And I'm Cheryl Gunselman, and I'm the Manuscripts Librarian here.
The records were, for the most part, it was a project spearheaded by President Holland during the days of World War II and immediately after World War II. And he felt strongly about honoring the soldiers who were both actively serving at the time and more particularly those who had been killed in the war. So he sat down and he wrote every time one of the soldiers, every time they learned one of their students, faculty, alumni, staff, whoever had been lost, he sat down and wrote the parents, wrote the families, asked them to tell them stories about them, asked them to send them back photographs, things along those lines, with the intent of publishing some sort of honorary book at the end of the war. Unfortunately, the book never happened. We don't know why. President Holland retired, but stayed active. My guess is the university then had to deal with the massive rush of GIs returning and trying to find faculty for them, trying to find housing for them. In any case, they never published the book. But President Holland had collected all of these records. So they remained here in the President's office or the Registrar's office for many, many years and eventually came to the archives here, and we have these amazing stories, correspondence with family of many of the people who fought and were killed in World War II. One of the really lovely things that came out of this for me is one of your students, James Feller, was also employed here in Mass, so we had him sit down and put together a name-by-name index on all this, so now someone could go online and find Grandpa's name in there just by Googling Grandpa, and his name will come up.
Yes, I'll risk sounding like such an archivist or librarian and just say one of the things I think will be an enduring benefit that's a direct result of the project is this name index that we mentioned earlier, that, I don't know if we made it clear, that became part of the collection guide, that's the inventory that's actually online that can be searched. And so people can type a name into a search engine, and one of the things that should come up if they have a relative or someone they're investigating in this collection would be the guide to this collection that would just, it would expose, it would enable discovery in a way that it wasn't possible to do before.
For me, this is a project I particularly care about because I had an experience here in the archives where I encountered a World War I soldier, a casualty of World War I, a day before I discovered that he died, and for some reason as a result, these records have always had a fascination for me that way, and I am very excited to see the students getting out there, get these students, the casualties of World War II, getting out there.
Part of what we try to do here every day when we work with students is give them skills and hopefully help build their enthusiasm for working with these kinds of records in lots of different contexts. And so I hope by doing in-depth work on this project, they gain some confidence and some understanding about how sometimes it's worth doing the hard work of discovering things in archives because it can lead to a big payoff.
Two things. It's one, it's the practical experience of not just being in the archives doing an assignment you've been asked to do, but to doing something where you can connect on a personal level. And there's something I always say when we're doing exhibits and things like that about taking archives and turning them from black and white pictures and dusty papers and old books and turning them into real stories of real people who lived real lives, albeit unfortunately shortened lives in this particular case. But getting to see students making those type of connections, I like to think is a really important thing in the history field, that they're looking at history from that point of view.
My name is Stephen Berquist, and I was born and raised in Colville, Washington.
Hi, my name is Claire Thornton. I am a Master in Teaching student here at WSU. I graduated last May with my Bachelor's in History.
James Feller. I'm a graduating senior this semester from Seattle, Washington.
My name is Emily Aller, and I'm a second-year MA student.
My name is Braden Johnson. I'm a junior student here at Washington State University. I'm pursuing a major in journalism and media production.
My name is MJ Vega. I'm a graduating senior from Monroe, Washington.
I'm Nancy Nightingale. I am a junior.
With my interest in public history, I thought it was a great chance to help create a piece of historical work that would actually create interest in the general public.
I want to work in archives, like for a living. It's where I want to do with my life and my career. And this was like a chance opportunity to actively work in archives and actually start kind of doing some of the stuff people normally do in archival work, informing stories and information and histories.
I've done a project on my own on a Japanese American who lived in Monroe, and he fought in World War II, and I was kind of looking at his life and trying to find out everything that I could about him. And so that inspired me once I heard of the opportunity to try it out again and see if it was something that I'd like to do in the future.
I chose this project because as an MA student who potentially wants to go on to a PhD program, I really wanted the background of researching in an archive and historical primary documents. And I thought that this would be a great way to commemorate some World War II heroes.
I was really interested in what their life might have been like serving, and since they're also from WSU, you know, there's a connection.
Fall semester, I chose Toseike, and what kind of drew me was that he's the only Japanese student we have in these files. Like that. This is Toll. He was the middle child of two brothers. He has some sisters as well, but there's three brothers. All of them went to this school. Toll was in service and was part of that all Japanese regiment.
The 442nd.
442nd.
Right.
And then kind of just went around Europe with them until October when they were in, I'm not good at saying the name of those mountains.
The Vosges Mountains, right.
Okay.
This is October of 1944.
Yes.
It's in France, right?
Yeah, so that's when he was in the Vosges Mountains and was looking for that Texas regiment that
Right.
went missing, and he would die like one day before they get back in contact with the rest of their unit. In the spring, I went with Marvin Palmer. He is originally from Denver, Colorado, but he would move to Washington like a good few years before he'd become a student here. He's pretty adultish by the time he enlists in the 40s. Even though he has an education degree, he works at Lockheed. And that's kind of what he was doing, and would be sent off to do missions in Africa primarily. He's in the Air Force and would just do bombing missions there. It was just an admin ride. Something went wrong with the plane and they just crashed.
It's a mechanical failure.
Yeah, and died.
This was in India.
Mm-hmm. And he got buried in Barakpur for a while, and then in 49, they moved his body to Hawaii.
So I chose George Arthur Davison, and he, I was looking through the big book of all the servicemen from WSU, and I noticed that he served in the 3rd Infantry Division, which is the same division my grandfather served in. He ultimately ended up a 2nd lieutenant in 3rd Division, and then he spent 1944 stationed at WSU with the Junior ROTC. he was home for a visit in January 1945, and he was reporting that he was going to return back to camp in Maryland, and then 2 months later, in March of 1945, he was killed. All of the obituaries in the newspapers, be it the Daily Evergreens or Twin Falls, it just said that he was killed in action, and so I'm assuming that it was very early after they arrived in Germany. It was in southern Germany, and about a week after he was killed, the 3rd Infantry crossed the Rhine River.
Don Carlos Hempstead. He joined WSU as an electrical engineer, and he went to WSU from 1940 to 41. Assessed Second Lieutenant Hempstead participated in the landing attack on Ednegby and Perry Islands, Eniwok Atoll, Marshall Islands, and it was on February 18th through the 19th and February 26, 1944. He suffered a lot of wounds from it, and eventually he succumbed to his wounds and passed away. It was after his death he was awarded the Navy Cross.
You chose Private First Class Robert Skillings Moon. Why did you pick him?
Well, it was a process of, I guess elimination, you could say, and there was, almost 200 servicemen to choose from, which, half of them were probably in the Pacific Theater, so we had to choose somebody from the European theater. Munn's family members gave not only a lot of information about his military experience, but they also gave quite a bit about his actual personal life, and the way they wrote about him kind of, it gave me an idea of who he was as a person, which sounded as kind of a happy-go-lucky kid, really. He was pretty young when he died. I think he was 19 or 20. He was majoring in agriculture. He was agriculture science, and he belonged to a fraternity, so he was fairly well involved. He did not graduate. He ended up enlisting in the army at the time. And during his basic training, his unit was deployed to Tunisia first, but he didn't really fight in Tunisia. So he was sent to Tunisia and then sent to Italy afterwards, and he fought there for about a year and a half and eventually died in 1945.
Leon Ellsworth, he was from Thorpe, and he only attended WSU for about a semester before he dropped out. And he was living in Pullman, working. His mother described it as a really terrible job. She never said what it was, but she said that she was pretty miserable there. And then he signed up to fight in the Marines and the Air Force. He actually gets into a mid-air collision in Pasco, and both of the people survive, but it's kind of this brush with death. And his mother remembers in a letter sent to the university that he loved flying, so obviously it did not faze him. He graduates from Corpus Christi, Texas. He's a second lieutenant by the time he gets to Iwo Jima, and he flies about 2 straight weeks of very low altitude missions in an unarmored observation plane, and it's just, he earns at least like 5 or 6 medals for his gallantry. They were under constant fire every mission that they went through because they were flying low altitude, and he just got unlucky. On March 13th, he was actually hit by Japanese fire, and the plane lost its wing, and both of them died in the crash. I believe he's buried in Iwo Jima. I've seen a headstone application for him from his family. I found that. So, and I believe that's in Thorpe or Ellensburg. It's in the area. My other serviceman was Lauren Love. He was a very popular student. He was in Phi Mi Alpha, which was a symphonic club at the university. He was in TKE, Thou Kappa Epsilon, and he was in many of the bands. He was in the symphony, he was in the orchestra, he was the pep band leader for the basketball team. So he's a very, very popular guy, and there's a lot written on him. It was actually very surprising that the man from Colville would have the most information out of the two. There's constant references to him in the Chinooks. There's plenty of references of him in the Daily Evergreen. He was there was an article that said that he was in the running for, he was one of the top 10 most handsome men at the college. There was also a summer article of him, there was a little blurb in the Daily Evergreen that said that Lauren Love was using his name to his advantage in tennis. What struck me about Lauren Love the most is, well, frankly, his name. His name and who he was, you know, he's a kid in the band. And his, you know, he's a very slender individual. He's not exactly a big strapping man. But then I read a citation, and it absolutely blew me away. He graduates in 1940. He goes to OMAC to teach music at the school system there. And then, you know, the war breaks out. He takes some time off when he enlists, and he becomes a logger for a brief amount of time. And then he goes off to train, and he sees his first action with the Marines on Tarawa, second lieutenant to a first lieutenant, because of the battle. And then he's sent to Saipan, and during the initial landings there was a Japanese counterattack, and his citation reads that over the course of 2 days in June that he was one of the guys who was leading and rallying the troops who had just landed under a lot of fire, under actual fire, artillery explosions everywhere. He was directing people and making sure that they were safe and that they were where they needed to be to hold off the Japanese. And he was hit in the shoulder by a bullet, and he was given morphine and sent back to the hospital ship, but apparently the bullet had ricocheted and hit one of his vital organs, so he dies at sea. His parents got the news like a month later. They got the news that he was wounded, and they didn't really get an update until like several months later, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. He was beloved by everybody that was serving under him, and the man who was writing the letter actually said that I will miss him as I missed my brother.
I researched Horace Corbett Jr. What really drew me toward researching him was the fact that when we first had our preliminary meeting about rolling out what was the pilot version of this project, we were trying to keep it alphabetized. So I had it in the back of my mind to try and select a serviceman who served in the European theater and was killed in action whose last name either began with the letter A, the letter B, or the letter C. I found out that Horace Corbett was the only one on that list that had sufficient records here at Washington State, who was from my home state of Oregon as well. He's from Tiller, Oregon, actually, and that's what really piqued my interest about him, is Tiller, Oregon's not even it doesn't even pop up on a current version of the Oregon State map. Horace Jr. was only enrolled at Washington State for about a year, because on November 7th, 1941, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. I would note too that this was about a month before the bombing of Pearl Harbor even took place, and Germany had invaded Poland in September of 1939. So I came to this realization that it was obvious that Horace Jr. might have even had in his mind the possibility that he was going to ultimately enlist in the war effort even before he enrolled at Washington State College. He completed his base training in Lakefield and Phoenix, Arizona. It was at that point in time that he rose to the rank of first lieutenant, so he was already a very gifted flyer. As his dad even said, you know, as we knew it, he could fly anything. The AAC gave Horace Jr. the option to pick whatever type of fighter plane he wanted to fly before departing over to the European theater. He was skilled enough as a fighter pilot that he could fly literally anything that they threw at him. That's what made him such a successful lieutenant. So Horace Jr. is a member of the 15th Air Force. That fighting squad spawned the Balkans and South Germany, covering the Mediterranean and then parts of Italy as well too. And they also participated in various missions across Poland and Czechoslovakia as well too. And Horace was a member of the 71st Fighter Squad within the 15th Air Force. After completing several missions, he was killed in January of 1945 during an air raid over South Germany in the early hours of January 6th. It was reported that his plane was shot down almost instantaneously, and then all members of that P-58 crew perished shortly thereafter.
In the World War II in Europe class, I researched Major John Hurley from San Francisco. What caught me about him was his dates of attendance. he attended in the mid-30s originally, and I was confused as to why he would have been in the war when he was so much older than everyone else, and it turned out that he had come back for his master's degree as well. He'd been here 6 years, and he played for athletics teams at Washington State College, and he'd been a coach during his graduate program, and then he went on to teach high school, and he had a life outside of college. He wasn't just a college student. He was in his late 20s. He had a life, he had a family, and he still decided to join the Army when the time came, and became a major, and yet still led troops into combat and died doing it. His story was just very moving because it showed how much of an impact he had on the university after he was gone, that people still cared. They still wanted to know about him even though he'd been gone from the university for years. This semester in the Asia Pacific course, I researched Lieutenant Charles Kirkham from Sunnyside, Washington. He was here from 1941 to 1942. Since he was here very briefly, there's nothing in the yearbooks. There's hardly anything to find. So I think he was actually only here a semester. His enrollment would have carried over, so it would have been reported as a year, but I think he joined up fairly soon, probably early 1942 at the latest. Kirkham died in late June of 1945. He was an airman in the Navy, and they were returning from an airstrike on Kyushu. His wingman was shot down and went down in the ocean. He circled his wingmen, reporting their position over and over again for the rescue planes to get to them, and eventually he ran out of fuel. And the last reported radio contact with him was, "I'm going down to join up." And neither of them were ever seen. Their bodies were never recovered, the planes were never found. And just the sheer act of willingly sacrificing himself in the hopes of saving his wingmen, it just showed his loyalty to his comrades and the brotherhood that he had with them, and it was very moving.
The stories of these individual men who aren't, the generals, who aren't the presidents or the leaders of nations, are just as important and just as captivating. And there's something to learning about their stories and preserving them. And it reinforced the fact that that's something that I would like to do in the future, is making sure that these men are not lost to time.
The research that you do and the time that we spend discussing certain concepts and eras of history and lecturing the films that we watch, it's really only, your time spent doing so is only as good as the efforts that you make to share that and convey that with the public at large. I realized I could commit 1 hour a week to go research in the library, and I've already written research papers before too. And I knew too that I needed to grow more familiar with the resources provided here at the WSU libraries and their special collections, manuscripts, archives, all of that. So in sum, this was a chance for me to fulfill that obligation I felt that I needed to take upon myself of giving something back to the history community, and then maybe some individuals interested in this particular era of history.
In World War II specifically, it just becomes really easy to make it about military battles and statistics of what happened and the methods and which unit did what thing. And all of these individual people become a mash of one unit. And yes, there's definitely an identity thing and an importance of having this unit identity. But there's also just they're individuals. They're individual stories with individual histories, individual likes and needs and wants and dislikes, that gets lost in all that. And some of these stories are incredible, amazing things. Toll has an entire botanical garden named after him. But it kind of gets lost. Mm-hmm. And even for this university, those stories get lost as well, because the story we like to talk about is whatever happened at the latest football game. But there's also stories like this that kind of would allow more people that can relate to and find themselves in, and can kind of bring a more human understanding of the war than just the military understanding that we normally approach it with.
That's beautiful. I think we can stop right there. That's great.